Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. As one of the team members of Bangladesh Liberation Archives, I thank my colleagues for giving me this opportunity to moderate the discussion on the reminiscence of Bangladesh Liberation War. I am particularly honored by the fact that the panelists this afternoon are not only related to the Bangladesh War of Liberation, but also, and indeed more importantly, they are renowned and eminent personalities on their own rights. Before we delve into the deeper discussions, may I take this privilege to briefly introduce our distinguished speakers this afternoon. Ambassador Akramul Qader became the ambassador of Bangladesh to the USA in 2009, a career diplomat with a cabinet rank of state minister appointment. During 1990s, Ambassador Khadir served as Bangladesh's High Commissioner to South Africa, concurrent appointment to Zimbabwe, Swaziland, Lesotho, and Namibia, and to Thailand, concurrent appointment to Cambodia. He also served as a permanent representative of Bangladesh to the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Shall we give a very big hand to Ambassador Akramul Qader? I would also like to mention that Ambassador Khadir lost his two brothers in our War of Liberation in 1971. We will hear from him the tales of personal tragedies. May I also introduce Dr. William Greenough, Professor of Medicine and International Health, Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and Bloomberg School of Public Health. His connection to Bangladesh started in 1962 when, as one of the first doctors, he opened the Cholera Research Laboratory and Hospital, and subsequently from 1975 to 1985, he served as the director of the renowned International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research, Bangladesh. He also served as the president of Bangladesh Information Center, Washington, D.C. from 1971 to 1984. Drawing his first-hand experience on our liberation, his talk would emphasize how the historical exploitation in the colonial times, which continued under the aegis of Pakistan, was overcome with the birth of a new nation, Bangladesh. A big hand to Dr. William Greenough. We have Mr. Thomas A. Dine, who has had a 51-year career in American Foreign Affairs. He joined the U.S. Peace Corps as a teaching volunteer in the Philippines in 1962 to 64. Shortly thereafter, he served at the Peace Corps headquarters in Washington, D.C. as the congressional liaison for the agency. He then served as the personal assistant to Ambassador Chester Bowles at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, India, from 1967 to 1969. Mr. Dine returned to Washington and served a decade in the U.S. Senate as foreign and defense policy expert for Senators Frank Church, Edmund Muskie, and Edward Kennedy. Mr. Dine currently is engaged in non-profit undertakings, senior advisor regarding U.S. Syria connections, and at Search for Common Ground, consultant to the U.S. Middle East Television and Radio Broadcasting Network. Mr. Dine will focus on how the Bangladesh situation in 1971 galvanized fierce opposing political forces, executive branch versus the legislative branch versus the media inside Washington, D.C., that ultimately benefited America's constitutional system of checks and balances and ironically benefited the new nation's relationship with the U.S. A big hand to Thomas Dine. Last but not least, we have Mr. Ziauddin Chodri, who joined the civil service of the erstwhile Pakistan in 1968 and worked as sub-divisional officer in Munshiganj and Manikganj of Greater Dhaka district in 1971. After independence, he worked as a special assistant in the Prime Minister's Secretariat under Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the founding father of Bangladesh, for a brief period. He joined the World Bank in 1983, where he worked in different capacities until 2011. He is the author of 3 books, Assassination of Ziaur Rahman and Aftermath, Fight for Bangladesh, and 40 Years of Bangladesh. Mr. Chodri will detail the history of Liberation War. Before we move on to this afternoon's discussion and listen to our distinguished speakers, may I let you know that after the 4 speakers have finished their speeches, the audience will have the opportunity to participate in a Q&A sessions and may ask questions to any of our speakers or may ask general questions which the speakers may address. Talking about the reminiscence of Bangladesh Liberation War, one might quote from Charles Dickens' novels, The Tale of Two Cities, where Dickens says, quote, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair." And today we would hear from our distinguished speakers on this broader theme of reminiscence of Bangladesh Liberation War, where we believe they will focus on why the epoch-making 9 months in 1971 were the best of times and the worst of times. May I now have the opportunity to invite Dr. William Greenough, whose talk would emphasize how the birth of a new nation, Bangladesh, challenged the colonial exploitation which continued till the Pakistani days up until 1971. Dr. Greenough.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Mr. Anis Ahmed, moderator, Excellency Ambassador Akramul Qader, and distinguished panel, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be brief, and I'll have time afterwards during interactive discussion to relate some of the anecdotes that may be interesting to the audience. First, I would like to say that the real heroes of today were the people who lost their lives fighting for freedom of Bangladesh, and we should all remember them with our prayers and our respect and admiration. I first arrived in Bangladesh in 1962 with my family, well before the war, but I remember hearing stories about the language movement and understanding that the language was very important to this country, its culture, and it was a very ancient culture, very deep, very rich in arts, science, and music. And at that time, I began to understand that Pakistan, a remote central government from Bangladesh, was forcing a language to be the only language in that country, which seemed to me extremely unfair. As time moved on, I was occupied with taking care of cholera patients. I'm not a politician, but many friends educated me as the depth of the culture, of the brilliance of intellect of Bangladesh, and I had direct contact with wonderful help at the cholera lab of the physicians, and someone's in the audience, Mr. Chowdhury, Brigadier Chowdhury, was very helpful in setting up the lab. Many people were helpful to us when we first came and established this. So over that period, it was clear to me that there was a disconnect, that you had a remote government that was imposing its will on what should have been a single country as if it were still a colony under the United Kingdom rule. And this seemed very odd to me. I didn't understand it at the time, and it was clear that we were on a collision course, that this could not go on with the people and friends I knew in Bangladesh, that there would have to be some accommodation. And when I came back to this country, I was still in touch. My colleagues were at the cholera laboratory. I was in touch with them. And I could see the escalation of tension as time went on during that period, which culminated on March 27th when the genocide started and the tanks rolled and attacked the university, killing many people. And immediately, within less than 24 hours, I was hearing, as were many of my colleagues who had been in Bangladesh, what was happening, but through direct personal communication. And this was tremendously upsetting because we knew that many of our friends were going to be losing their lives, having to escape. And I knew one of my closest friends had to walk the next day from Bangladesh into India. It took him several weeks to get there. So we were aware of the impending refugee situation, and we were also aware of the destruction going on in Dhaka at an early point. And we talked to each other, people who had been at the cholera laboratory, to find out, is there anything we could do about this? Obviously, what we could do was less than what people in Dhaka could do. We knew shortly that our government, the executive branch, President Nixon, Henry Kissinger, were saying things were absolutely wrong in the newspaper, on the media. Pictures were taken in Dhaka of a year past showing there was nothing going on. And this was outrageous to us. But we were innocents, doctors, but we decided we would go to Washington and figure out if there's some way that we could do something, because we knew that arms were being shipped to Bangladesh. Our government was aggressively supporting President Yahya Khan. We knew that this was wrong. And so some of us walked into Tom Dine's office, and he immediately recognized that we could perhaps make a difference, and he triaged us, saying that the best thing we could do is bring information to the legislative branch and try to get what was actually going on across the American public, since the President and the State Department were not willing to do this and had what we call a disinformation campaign. And thanks to this check and balance, the legislative branch worked, and Tom, I'm sure, will talk more about that, and guided us like small school children around the corridors of power in Washington, which was quite an education for me. And it turned out that the best way to accomplish the task was simply to gather eyewitness documents, photographs, anything we could from Bangladesh through people who were there and coming out, people who were still there, and set up in a small row house what was called the Bangladesh Information Center. Had no money, we knew nothing about lobbying, but I had 3 people who were willing to spend time there. One was David Weisbrod, and another was David Nayland, who's a physician who worked at the cholera laboratory, and a third was Kaiser Zaman. And they gathered as much information as they could and kept feeding it into the Congress, mainly through Tom Dine's office. And shortly thereafter, the Bangladesh delegation stepped down from the Pakistan embassy. I remember that morning on Massachusetts Avenue when Muhis led the group out of the embassy onto the pavement, and I thought, my Lord, these are people who have families. Now they have no job, no passport, nothing except the courage to step down and go try and establish a new country. So, and there were many other things I will talk about perhaps in the after session of the protests in Lafayette Park. An anecdote that was very important to me, in which I received documents showing arms shipments to Pakistan to defeat Bangladesh. I'm not the hero of that. The real hero was the person who smuggled those documents out of the Pakistan embassy under her sari and got them to my doorstep, understanding that I would take them and do something with them. And then Tad Shulk, who was the investigative reporter at the New York Times, who said, well, I thought he'd publish it immediately, but he said, no, you wait. And he actually went up and took photographs of the arms shipments in Hoboken, New Jersey, and got it on the front page of the New York Times, which impressed me, one, that someone was a real investigative reporter, and 2, that you could have impact in that way. I'm going to stop here. Thank everyone for being here. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to hear from Tom Dine and the other members of the panel. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. William Greenough. We know how well you are attached to Bangladesh till today on both health and humane ground, and also you have a special feelings for Bangladesh right since you started as long back as in 1962. We are grateful to hear stories of 1971 from you. We now invite Mr. Zyaotin Chodri to speak about his reminiscence of the War of Liberation of Bangladesh. He will focus on People's War and on how the ordinary Bengalis faced the challenges of war with a deep aspiration to free their country. So he speaks on the unsung heroes of our liberation war. Mr. Ziauddin Chowdhury.
Thank you, Anis Ahmed, and thanks to the Liberation Archives, Bangladesh Liberation Archives, for inviting me to speak about my own reminiscence, as Anis puts it. And thanks to our other distinguished panelists, including our ambassador, Khadir. To begin or to talk about the reminiscences that one had during the awful days of 1971, it will probably not one seminar, not two seminars, several seminars, maybe lasting over days. And many of us who had witnessed these things firsthand, they know how terrible they were. During that period of 1971, I happened to be a young sub-divisional officer. Those of you of near that vintage will remember how the districts were organized into subdivisions, and each subdivision had a civilian administrator known as the sub-divisional officer. I was thrust into this immediately after I had joined, which was 1971 February. After that, it was one could say a nightmare, another could say an experience once in a lifetime. I served in two subdivisions, first in Munshiganj from February till June, and then July through October in Manikganj. In October, I left my position. You could say, in Pakistani parlance, I became a deserter. In 1971, what I had seen, essentially I had seen from one side, because I did not or could not participate directly in the War of Liberation. But I had seen what others did from within. And in fact, had this not been due to these people, who I call the unsung heroes of our liberation war, perhaps we would not have been lucky to get the country we have now, at least not within the time frame that we got it. Our war was, while it was fought from across the border by people who had crossed over, a large number of whom were armed people, soldiers, Bengali soldiers, policemen, but also just plain students. They joined what we all know to be Mukti Bahini, and they joined shoulder to shoulder. They fought shoulder to shoulder with the other armed people. They were trained, some of them not so trained. What we, perhaps some of us may not know, that large number of these people who were what called the freedom fighters, they fought from within. They never crossed the borders. Those who know about Tangail, those who know about Manikganj, those who know about Faridpur, riverine districts of Bangladesh particularly, you would know that many of them, they were inside and they fought from inside. And I had occasions to interact those people even at the risk of what I was doing under the watchful eyes of the army. All of these I took time to write in what you call in small packages, and I inscribed them in a book which I published 2-3 years ago. These were articles that were written over a large period of time, and the book is titled Fight for Independence. There I record the ranks and of these unknown and forgotten fighters for liberty of our country were filled by students, farmers, small shopkeepers, and village wives. They are the unsung heroes of the Liberation War, who we may not remember. As Dr. Greenough said, we do not have a lot of time to go over all these that I have narrated, but I would selectively cite few instances where each of this group that I described took part and what their contributions. The first instance, again, I'll take you through a journey, so to speak, of what I myself had experienced and we had at times purely helplessly. The first one in Munshiganj, just to put it on record, Munshiganj, those who may not know, is a subdivision which is just only maybe 30 miles away from Dhaka. But in those days, Munshiganj was accessible only by water. You had to have a river craft, a launch, what you call. And as an SDO, I had what you call a motor launch with which I had to come down to Dhaka. Therefore, anybody trying to reach Munshiganj, they had to have plans of spending several hours to go to Dhaka. On 26th of March, when news arrived that the army had launched its mayhem in Dhaka, we were expecting any moment anything to happen in Munshiganj. In fact, every hour when I was there, I would get a rumor of army descending right on the borders, even though we did not know what actually had transpired in Dhaka. It was maybe 24 hours later that I would know that entire police barrack, Radharwar police line was attacked and totally decimated, and how people were lying strewn over the streets, completely taken unaware of, completely unaware they were shot down like birds. But that would arrive, the news would arrive to us like 24 hours later. But what we witnessed at that time, streams of people coming from Dhaka by river boats. As I said, from Dhaka it took several hours to come. Right at that moment, these people, the students of Horoganga College that time, they decided to loot the armory. They went in a body without anybody trying to resist them. They took over the arms and they were ready to face the army. Now, it was a stupendous task to tell them that it would be futile to face a modern army with 303 rifles, and that also only 24 of them. Anyway, when the army did not arrive, after 3 or 4 days, these people surrendered their rifles and then went back to their homes. Army did not arrive. But within next 5 to 6 days, army did arrive, but not in Munshiganj. They went to a place called Gazaria, and there they shot down several villages, people for no reason, as they did everywhere else. After they had gone back, the same students groups formed a body. I don't know from where they would get this, but they blew up the Gazaria Bridge. That was the first instance of student-inspired, student-led sabotage action in Munshiganj. That was in April of 1971. From there, some of the students, they joined the regular Mukti forces, Mukti Bahini. They went to India. Some of them remained within Bangladesh. So that was the first thing that we would see. Subsequently, army would arrive in Munshiganj, but that was in May. I was taken in custody. I would go to the cantonment. After several days of interrogation, it was a daily interrogation. In army's parlance, I was found to be gray, not black, not white, but gray. But as a punishment, I was posted out to Manikganj. Manikganj was, again, not very far, but this was accessible by road. It was only, again, 30, 40 miles away from Dhaka headquarters. There it was in the month of late June and July, where the monsoon was early that year, and army had deployed militia. This was a paramilitary group. They had deployed them in various thanas as aid to the police. It was ostensibly to support the police, but they were actually have surveillance over police, because army had lost its trust in police after what had happened. This is where the second incident, second and third incident that I describe in the book, and it is worth narrating here, is again where the ordinary farmers and even village wives took part in an attack on this militia. There is a place called Shaturia in Manikganj, which is again, during rainy months, it is accessible only by water. So since the army couldn't take their convoys by road, the roads were all submerged, flooded, so they had to take these canals, and they had rented these engine boats, they are called, or speed boats. Again, they were surprised by an attack by local freedom fighters. They tried to swim. They tried to swim. Actually, the boat capsized, and the villagers, farmers, they had their role in taking whatever they thought was possible for them. This was done by both farmers and including, if you would believe, including the women of this village. After this, the local army commander, of course, decided it was not worthwhile to send any more the militias to those thanas, but instead they did what they do all the time. They took a bigger boat and armed it with machine guns and sprayed all the villages that were laid out along the river bank. They, of course, they didn't. No, these are.
We'll go for the question sessions later on.
So that's the other thing. This is the another thing another group of people that I talk about in my book. The fourth group, again, were the unsung heroes, and some may take issue with this, but these were also the police officials who are in the thanas, ordinary constables, and in those days we had what we call a band of people who would be managing these thanas called the circle officers. Their role was not only to sabotage the army's work there by disobeying what they were instructed to, pretending to follow the orders and actually not executing them, The first one was a little bit, there is a bit of a comedy here also. This happened in Munshiganj. In Munshiganj, the army commander had decided that one of the evils that the Bengalis were inspired by was the Shohid Minar, which was a statue, if you recall in those days, it was a monument almost like resembling what he would say, he would say, Shiva Lingam. And he said, these are nothing but worship of an un-Islamic practice. So we have to demolish these things, and this is what you people are following. Is in the name of following your language and all that, you have erected a monument which resembles this. So we have to destroy each one of them. If you recall, in Dhaka, they had one of the things, the first destroyed was the Shahid Minar. But that Shahid Minar was shaped not like today. See, this was shaped. It was a triangular monument. So first he started, and he and his forces destroyed whatever there was within Munshiganj town. But then when he heard that there was one in every thana or every union primary school, he said, well, we have to destroy all of them. So he asked the police officers, you have to destroy each one of them, and that's your duty. So how do you ensure that we have destroyed all of these things? We cannot send anyone there. So why don't you send us a certificate of destruction? And that will do. So the certificate of destruction, that's also the army's jihad against the Shahid Minars. That's one of the articles in that book. So that's where the police officer, he also played a role. But this is on the lighter side. On the serious side, every time there would be an attack or raid on a police station by Mufti Bahini, routinely each and every rifle would be stolen or lost. And the policemen and the army would go to this police station and, of course, find out that the police, each one of them is very safe. No one was killed, but each rifle was stolen. How did that happen? Sir, they tied us, tied our hands, and then looted the rifles. Well, why don't you prevent them? Sir, they were too powerful. Again, they couldn't, you see, in those, when the peak of 1971 war, this was not in the priority list to kill every policeman, because there were already shortage of manpower within the army. As I said, they had to bring in militia, paramilitary force. So there they had to accept the fact that there is a lot of suspicion around why a person should not be killed, and then all the rifles would be lost. So there again, the policemen played a very easy game of pretending to protect the Thana, but lose their firearms to the freedom fighters. Third, again, these are the people who did that. At that time, the army was trying to fill up its depleting rank of militia with locally trained militia. Again, they wanted to replenish the Ansars, which, if you recall, you see, they were totally destroyed. So they trained people who were unemployed youths, villages. They scouted the village, and then they got these people, and then they recruited them within and gave them training or like maybe 2-3 weeks, and sent them to Thanas. In Daulatpur, in one of these subdivisions, Thanas in Manikganj, there they sent the first trained group of 150 people trained with, equipped with arms, rifles. Within 1 week, all of them decamped and joined the freedom fighters. So that is how these people, the police and others, they played the role. The last one that I would like to mention is during September of 1971, in order to placate the foreign nations, particularly when the Western press, they were talking about large-scale uprooting and targeted attacks on the minorities. The central government dished out large sums of money to then East Pakistan, saying rehabilitation grants for the minorities, more precisely, read Hindus. And by that time, majority of the village and towns, there were no Hindus left, because they had left either for the villages inside or in the bordering districts for India. But within Manikganj, there was a substantial, it's a large number of Hindus still living in the villages who had left their towns, their trade and everything. So when the money arrived, we had instructions to give it away to Hindu minorities, ostensibly to rehabilitate, because the government by that time, they had recognized that many of these houses were ravaged, burned down, so they should be given help. This was the official position. Within few days of receiving the money, we received words on telephone, this money is actually given to you to hand it over to the army commanders. On paper, it will be money to given for Hindu rehabilitation, but actually you should give it away to the army commander, and he will come and contact you. All of, I'm not the only one who did that. All of us distributed the money directly to the circle officers with instructions to give away the money to the local, whoever in the population was, within 24 hours. And they all did it and provided the certificate, well, this money is given and nothing is left to give to the army commanders. Those who were not able to do, they had to give it to them. So this would not have been possible had all of these people down the pipe had not collaborated. So these are the people among the government officials who also actively participated in the War of Liberation. I could go on and on. There are many other incidents that I could describe where a housewife intervened to save one entire village in Munshiganj because she had got word from her maid. This was a Hindu officer, second officer of Munshiganj, who received the word that the village where the Hindus were located would be targeted for destruction the next day. Overnight, she sent the word, all of them migrated back to the town. When the army went there, of course, they burned down the houses, but majority of the Hindu lives was saved only because a housewife got word and she was able to transmit this information to the people that she cared about. I could perhaps go on, but for lack of time, and also many of you may have questions which I'll be happy to answer. But again, let me repeat that this war is a war that was fought. We had at that time 7 crores people, 1 crore left for, as we say, 1 crore plus, 10 million plus left for India, but 60 million plus remained within Bangladesh. Had this not been due to the active participation of the 60 plus million who were left behind, our liberation would have been, well, we would have achieved it, but it would have been much later than we did. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chodri, for your very excellent presentation, and perhaps it has been focused on people who fought war within Bangladesh, and at the same time, very little things. Apparently, they are very little things, but they really contributed to the achievement of Bangladesh's independence. And thanks to Mr. Chodri as well for another reason, because he was in a very crucial situation in those days, being an administrator within the Pakistani regime when the Pakistanis were attacking Bengalis, and partly he had to suffer. He was interrogated as well. So it was a kind of very strategic responsibilities which Mr. Ziauddin Chodri had performed and seen the war from within. Now, the whole idea of Bangladesh Liberation Archive is to listen to this reminiscence of Bangladesh Liberation War from different angles, from different perspectives. We will now look into the perspectives from outside. I now have the privilege of inviting Mr. Thomas A. Dine, and he, while recalling 1971, will talk about opposing political forces in the USA during Bangladesh Liberation War. Mr. Dine.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here with all of you. My perspective is Bangladesh in Washington in 1971. One thing that has not been articulated as yet, but I want to do that before I begin my presentation. All of this destruction, all of this death, all of this cruelty followed an open and free election. The country of Pakistan conducted an election in December 1970. And I say this to all the children that are here. There is nothing like a democracy, and the first step of a democracy is to have free and fair elections. So the fact that there had been an election in which the Awami League won, the Awami League being the political party of then East Pakistan, and was not accepted by West Pakistan, was the first violation of democracy, rule of law, human rights. Having said that, the Pakistani Civil War and the horrible violence of that war and the liberation of Bangladesh created a full-scale conflict here in Washington. You know, the Constitution is a living document, and in it there are three branches of government that are to be in conflict with each other as policy is debated. And as that policy is debated, there's a struggle, particularly when people disagree over the policy. In 1970 and 71, this city was polarized. The word polarized is used today and probably in all your cables home. Oh, Washington is polarized, Republicans in the House and Democrats in the Senate and Democrats in the... Well, it's been polarized most of our history because of the Constitution. And that's how you get acceptance of policy. In 1970 and 71, enormous debates about the Vietnam War, the War Powers Act. The Mansfield Amendment, which was then infamous, was to withdraw troops from Europe. It was always defeated, but it created conflict about this. The foreign policy schools of thought, the realists, so-called realists, who believe whatever happens internally in some other society is up to them. We just pursue American interests. And the idealists believe that there must be democracy, human rights, and to break away from dictators. And certain Americans just fall in love with dictators. And I'll come back to our infamous lover, Richard Nixon. Nuclear arms control agreements. Will there be, will there not be with the Soviet Union? And then March 25th occurred in 1971, the Pakistan War. I walked home that night and said to my wife, who's sitting in the front row, it's genocide. I can tell from this distance it's genocide. The destruction, the intent to destroy another people. And sure enough, 9 months later, we saw the desecration. So the Pakistan struggle and the struggle over policy toward Pakistan became an existential episode here in Washington. My own career had involved me in the subcontinent. First of all, I have a fierce devotion to democracy, rule of law, and human rights, which has been part of my career. But I first visited India in 1964, and I arrived in New Delhi the night that Jawaharlal Nehru died, and followed the caisson the next day to the river for the ceremony and the burning of his body. I pursued a graduate degree at UCLA in South Asian history, and then shortly thereafter, I joined the staff, as mentioned earlier, as Agnes mentioned, of Ambassador Chester Bowles in New Delhi, and served 2 years as a special assistant there, 1967 to 69. I came back to Washington and worked 5 years for Senator Frank Church, a Democrat of Idaho. And foreign policy was my field, still is my field, but in devoting myself to ending our involvement in, over, and around Indochina, and then the Bangladesh crisis, as well as many others, we tried to expand foreign policy making and the debate over foreign policy beyond the White House, beyond the State Department, beyond the Defense Department. So first of all, the policy setters, in this case, was Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. It was described, their policy toward Pakistan was described later by the famous columnist Jack Anderson as a tilt toward Pakistan. But it was more than a tilt. Nixon loved the military dictators of Pakistan. When he was vice president under President Eisenhower, he visited India and Pakistan in 1954. And he declared himself then, I'm an ally of these military rulers. He loved the Sandhurst way that they stood versus the Indians, who were the intellectuals, and he called them at the time effete. And later on, some other bad words. Because my grandchildren are here, I won't say them until later. But they weren't fighters. That was a favorite expression of the Pakistani military. In fact, General Khan, the butcher, called the Indians not fighters. Similar language. Pakistan was an American ally in the Cold War. Pakistan signed the CENTO Treaty, the CETO Treaty, and of course the American Air Force used the Peshawar Air Force Base for B-52s. Oh, no, I understand that. That's where Gary Powers came from. So the U-2 spy aircraft and the B-52s with nuclear weapons on them. So Pakistan was an ally, a friend, and in the words of John Foster Dulles, our then Secretary of State in the 1950s, if you weren't an ally, you were an enemy. And India was an enemy under those circumstances. Nixon disdained and disliked Nehru, Krishna Menon, and then he had to deal with Indira Gandhi. Now I'm going to say this to my grandson. He called her a bitch, he called her a whore, he called her a prostitute, and in Washington there are no secrets. That kind of language came to us on Capitol Hill. So it was a secret that everybody knew about. And this is the personalization of foreign policy, which gets you into trouble almost every single time. And finally, when Mujibur Rahman became a public figure in the American thought process, he called him a puppet of Indira Gandhi. So a total distortion of reality and a total distortion of democracy because it was all done in secret. So the first reason for our tilt toward Pakistan in this horrible year, 1971, I'm not so sure I agree with your quotation from Dickens. It was a worse year. I don't see very much good year in it. The second factor here, besides the personalization of foreign policy, was our China policy, the China factor. It was Yahya Khan who facilitated Henry Kissinger going secretly to Beijing in July of 1971, and he met with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong. So Pakistan was a friend of both China and the United States in this critical year. The White House kept military spare parts going, and Dr. Greenough mentioned the good ship Padma, a commercial Pakistani ship carrying arms, spare parts arms to Pakistan when the administration told us in Congress over and over again, there are no more arms going to Pakistan. Been cut off, which was a total lie. It was the deceit of a secret policy. And then finally, Nixon and Kissinger sent a naval flotilla to the Bay of Bengal 4 days before the Pakistani army surrendered to the Indian army in December of 1971. What the flotilla was going to do, nobody was quite sure, but in the papers that became public, Kissinger at one point says, "We want to show the Chinese that we're good friends." So the White House, much to the anger and disappointment of the majority of the Senate and the House of Representatives, even the media coverage tilted toward the liberation of Bangladesh. And the public, when they knew that an election had been violated, definitely tilted away from Pakistan. But we, the United States, adopted a futile posture of condemning the side that would obviously win. We knew a couple of months into this whole genocidal affair that there would be a free, sovereign Bangladesh. When you kill your own people, there's no trust, there's no mucilage to hold a society together. So, the new Bangladesh was left with 93,000 Pakistani soldiers as prisoners of war, and the United States embarrassed. The opposition, because this Constitution creates this struggle over the direction of policy, the Senate came alive to this one. Doesn't always react strongly in foreign affairs, particularly during the Cold War, when the commander-in-chief had his fingers on the nuclear button in case there had to be a reaction to a Soviet invasion. You couldn't have debate in the Senate and the House. So the president became an imperial president by this time. But three senators stand out. I have a bias because I worked for one of them. But Senator Frank Church, Senator Edward Kennedy, whom I worked with later, and Senator William Saxby of Ohio, a Republican. And those three men basically led the fight in the Senate against the White House. And the press allied itself with this anti-White House group, using a steady stream of reporting, and therefore there were an inordinate number of Senate speeches on the floor of the United States Senate. Bucky Greenough's Bangladesh Information Center counted 50 different speeches over this period of time. Just in the Senate, about 34 in the House of Representatives. But besides Senate speeches, there were 37 sponsors to legislation. The Saxby Church legislation amendment to cut off arms to Pakistan, totally. And there were hearings by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But an unusual person here was Ted Kennedy. He was not a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was a member of the Judiciary Committee, and because there was a Democratic majority then, he created his own subcommittee. It was called the Subcommittee on Refugees of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And through that, he responded to the creation of 10 million refugees in India, Burma, Nepal, coming out of Bangladesh. It was an unusually active Senate for sure. There were trips by senators to the refugee camps in eastern India. And those trips gave senators one of the most important concepts in Washington, credibility. When a senator speaks who has credibility, others then listen. Dr. Greenough mentioned the Bangladesh Information Center, and I want to mention it again because he was the key founder, and David Nayland, but also John Rhodey. This is an example, particularly the young people here, how one person can make a difference. John Rhodey's roommate at Dartmouth College was Senator Saxby's son. And through that connection, Rhodey got to Saxby and educated him on the horrors that were taking place in South Asia and made a tremendous difference, and it allowed us on the Democratic side to be bipartisan. And finally, just a note of the nastiness that took place. But before I get to that, I want to recognize the fact that Bangladesh, Mr. Ambassador, had a very young pro-Bangladesh person that operated through her mother sitting right there. And there she is. She was 6 months old, that lady in purple back there, our daughter, Abby. And she was in her mother's arm with a bottle in her mouth when the Washington Post took this picture. It got into the it was a demonstration at Lafayette Park, and got into the newspapers, and we helped to make it a human event under those circumstances. And they all grow up. Finally, just a note of nastiness, and I'm taking the privilege of, I now have the mic. I was declared an enemy of the state of Pakistan. And to this day, I take that as a great honor. And I've never been there. And thanks to the government of Bangladesh, I've been to Dhaka. And the Assistant Secretary of State at the time for the Near East Affairs was Joe Sisko. I used to call him the Joe and Lie of the United States because he was always in power, no matter who was in power in the White House, Democrats, Republicans, whatever. He came to lobby Senator Church one day, and Senator Church asked me to sit in the meeting to take notes. And at one point, Sisko got very angry, and he pointed his finger at me and said, "He's the fifth column for India." And Frank Church said very calmly, "The era of Joe McCarthy is over. That is uncalled for in this office." And I just kept my mouth shut. So. The press. Information in this city is power. And most of the information flows through the written, now the electronic press. And newspapers and radio were critical in 1971, both in South Asia as well as here. As I mentioned, the steady stream of reporting, the horrors, the tragedies, the photographs of people living in sewer pipe cities spoke legions, and no government of Pakistan, no embassy of Pakistan could overcome that reporting. But the interesting battle took place among the commentators, those with columns. Liberal commentator Joe Kraft sided with Henry Kissinger. Conservative columnist Joe Alsop sided with Richard Nixon. And one Jack Anderson, who at the time had over 400 newspapers in the country to carry his column. And it was, the Washington Post carried it on the comic page. But he had readers, and he's the one who one night, surreptitiously, secretly, he got a phone call from a source to meet him, that source, who worked in the White House, at the Dart drugstore near the White House, where this source from the executive branch, a White House employee, gave him an envelope, a manila envelope he described, with all the documents in there demonstrating our tilt toward Pakistan, no matter what. So my quick summary is this. By the end of 1971 and the Indian-Bangla victory, and then the new nation of Bangladesh, the United States constitutional system showed that it was fluid, that it worked, but U.S. policy in South Asia was a shambles and a disgrace to Nixon and Kissinger, who prided themselves on their foreign policy professionalism and skills. Vietnam was a failure, Bangladesh was a failure, and they disgraced the United States. Thank you.
Mr. Thomas Dine, thank you so much for being very much outspoken on this particular issue, which have always remained a sort of sensitive issue. But you rightly pointed out the conflict between the U.S. administration, the then administration, and the political democratic forces, as well as the human story and press. Can we give a very big hand to Mr. Dine as well? We are happy that Mrs. Dine is here as well. A big hand to her. And we are glad Mrs. Greenough is here as well. A big hand to her. And the young lady at the back whose life runs almost parallel to Bangladesh's life. Thank you so much. Our final speaker this afternoon, after which we'll go to the Q&A session. Our final speaker this afternoon is His Excellency Ambassador Akramul Qader, whose personal tragedy during the War of Liberation has remained largely an untold tale to the Washingtonians. We have seen Ambassador Khadir speaking in different places, as an ambassador, mostly as chief guest, but today we have invited him to be here as a contributor to the Reminiscence of Bangladesh Liberation War, and he will actually focus on his personal tragedy, perhaps beyond. He lost his two brothers during the Bangladesh War of Liberation. Ambassador Qadir.
Thank you, Mr. Anis Ahmed. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The subject given to me is a very difficult one. Difficult one, of course, from a personal point of view. Although the sheer number of casualties, the shaheeds, the mothers and sisters, about whom every year we hear so many stories, we narrate so many stories, of course. It's a very painful task. Obviously, it becomes very difficult, when it comes to narrating those. I'm immensely honored to be here alongside three very distinguished intellectuals who spoke this afternoon about the reminiscence of the 71 war. I'm also glad, particularly because of the presence of Professor Greenough and Mr. Thomas Dine here, who were the recipients of our Liberation War Award. Belated though, we're very happy indeed to be able to honor them. My nation is proud of you. In War and Peace, Tolstoy noted that man cannot possess anything as long as he fears death. But to him who does not fear it, everything belongs. If there is no suffering, man would not know his limits, would not know himself. Tolstoy's submission predates Bangladesh's War of Liberation by more than a century. Personal sufferings are often essential in discovering self. However, exploring the extent to how much suffering would suffice in order to satisfactorily know oneself could be a very, very demanding academic undertaking in itself. I better refrain from stepping into that discussion. Dear friends, if you believe that my personal account surrounding the 1971 war would be of any interest for today's audience and worth telling them, I would like to be a bit candid and undiplomatic. The person speaking before you, just forget that he's an ambassador. I'm an ordinary person, just like you, belonging to a nation which suffered so much in 1971. At times I really become enraged, realizing that I was robbed of what could have been the most glorious phase of my life, a time when my nation was at war. Looking back, I can still feel what I once felt, a captive in a land that didn't belong to me. West Pakistan was captivity, and I, its captive. Finding no way to escape, I was to live in Islamabad at that time, working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We had sources, of course. We could get information of all types, the most reliable ones from our good friends in Dhaka. That was the advantage of being in the Foreign Office. We had cyber officers working in the ministry, some of them Bengalis. And that was a big advantage because they used to furnish a lot of information to us, and I still remember that we used to disseminate that amongst our colleagues, that is the Bengali colleagues working in the ministry. But then we were helpless. We knew what was happening there, but we just couldn't do anything. I even had information about my own family. I'm sorry, there's a problem with me always, I break out very quickly. I had a brother in the army who used to come to Islamabad very often at the weekends particularly, from his course which was taking in Nowshera, in the artillery school. All my colleagues know him. He was a captain in the Pakistan Army. Now, he had a very good friend, a West Pakistani young guy, who actually told him what possibly the military rulers were going to do against the Bengali nation. So he asked for leave exactly at a time when things would go wrong. He was in Dhaka on 25th night, and early in the morning on 26th they left. He left the house, and started towards Chittagong. On way, he, together with some other dissident group of EPRs, these are East Pakistan Rifles, they blew the Shubapur bridge near Feni and subsequently went to Ramgarh, the high school becoming the camp where he started training the young boys coming from different schools and colleges in the area and from other places. That was his permanent station. In fact, during the life and after life, that camp subsequently was the headquarters of Major Ziaur Rahman. Together with him was Major Shaukat, Major Rafiq, Captain Mafiz, and many others. It was there that fighting the Pakistani troops, he died on 27th April. The other brothers who left because our house in Dhaka became a target of the Pakistan Army and a civilian force called EPCAF, EPCAF, which was created later on to support the army and other units of Pakistani troops. Only my mother and the youngest brother was there. In fact, 5 of them went to war. 2 never came back. The captain still lies buried in Ramgarh graveyard, but the other brother, we don't know actually where he lies. He was last seen in November, precisely 23rd November, near Kustia, another district lying southwest of Bangladesh. And after that, he was never seen. Rest 3 of them came back. Now, instead of me, please consider my late mother. She lived with the harsh reality of never seeing her 2 sons. The 3 others who did come back, one of them actually escaped death because he was arrested, but somehow survived. He was a bodybuilder. He took a lot of beating from the Pakistan army chaps. In fact, when I escaped from Pakistan finally, in mid-72 actually, I saw his whole body multicolored. It was all black and blue. Even just the other day when he died, he couldn't chew properly anything because of the beating that he took. But then he survived. So, anyway, this is the sacrifice of just one family. There are many other families who have sacrificed. In our own locality, I remember there was a guy who was a municipal commissioner. As you have these councillors here in different parish or what do you call this? Counties here. Likewise, in our municipal areas, there used to be councillors. This guy was what we call Rajakar, the civilians who assisted the Pakistan army, because either they supported Muslim League or the Jamaat Islami of those days, openly siding with Pakistan. He was personally responsible in helping the army chaps pick up at least 26 youngsters from our own area. None of them was seen later. I remember to have been informed that this guy disappeared immediately after Bangladesh became independent. And the interesting thing is, he reappeared after 75. And not only he rehabilitated himself, he got his daughter married to a police officer. And within 2 years, he was back as a public figure, getting himself elected as a councillor again. Shame on us, and shame on we the locals of that area. It was very interesting. So that's how we behaved. And nationally also we behaved like that. And that is why the people who have been supporting genocide in Bangladesh, the people under whose leadership genocide was carried out, the people who are responsible for the killing of the intellectuals, including the Dhaka University professors, Rajshahi University professors, all these people, or a few of them rather, I should say, not only got elected themselves in the Parliament of Bangladesh, but were able to fly the flag of Bangladesh as ministers. Well, belated though, finally, it is simply because of these youngsters who are present here today that the nation has finally opened up. When I look at the Shahbag scenario, I think that 1971 is back, or 1962 is back. The nation is trying to repay its debt. They're going to try those, or at least some of those, who were responsible for the killings of many, many, many innocent, unarmed civilians and intellectuals of the country. Here from this podium, I will ask for your assistance, for your support to that particular cause for which the nation has again risen. I think it's moral obligation, it's our moral duty to support that and condemn the activities of those people who have reappeared with the same spirit as of 1971. And we can see that in their activities on the streets of Dhaka, what they are doing, how they go out to kill the people, how they destroy the country, and what they are up to. We don't want a country full of extremists. We want to get rid of them, and whatever it takes, we must get rid of these guys. I won't be able to say anything else, but then I'm here. You can ask me any question later on. I think that will be better for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Akramul Qader. We apologize for the pain that we caused you by requesting you to speak about your personal tragedies. But we do understand that the 3 million people in 1971, we lost 3 million people, and millions of families had gone through these tragedies. And this is why you rightly said that the perpetrators of crime against humanity and the war crime should be brought to justice. Thank you, all of you, because this reminiscence of Bangladesh Liberation War, which we heard from you, from distinguished speakers, brought in different angles together. It's just not one piece, but different perspectives, different dimensions. And we have seen, we have heard those things. And I'm so grateful to the honorable members of the panel to be present here and to speak. And thank you all for being with us We hope to organize these type of functions, these types of seminars and symposium in the days ahead. Thank you.